Hey guys, and welcome back to the Mr. R Show. Today we're going to be talking about polls, kind of what makes a good poll. I'm going to ask Ashton some questions because a little about him. He in college did some political classes, did some statistic classes, so he knows a lot more about polls. He is a nerd for polls. He obsesses over polls. That's his lifestyle. I'm just newly getting into that. I've always liked politics and stuff like this, but I'm not 100% all knowing when it comes to stuff like that. So what we're gonna do is I'm gonna take the place of kind of the average viewer or someone who just doesn't know much about polls. Ashton will be the kind of all-knowing being of polls, as in this video. So without further ado, we're gonna start and we're gonna talk about some polls. Yeah. So Ashton, the first question I'm going to ask about polls today, just so we can get a basic information about them, is a very simple one. How are polls conducted? That's a simple question.
Well, that's a hornet's nest for anyone who talks about validity of polls, because there's a
We're
lot of
not
room.
talking about what makes a good poll. I'm asking just in broadest terms possible, how do polling agencies conduct polls?
So most polls are conducted over phone lines. Newer ones are starting to include cell phones, but typically a pollster will have to conduct around, for a solid poll, around 1,000 to 2,000 phone calls, and then kind of change the amount of people to kind of follow what the subset of the voter base is. So if you have an election, let's say Missouri, where you have 60% white, 30% black, something like that, they're going to try to mimic that with that same amount of voters in a pool of phone calls. They try to do that with ages and as many metrics as they can get close to the voting population.
All right, sweet. My second question really is, how many people would you say is a good number to get a poll? So is 500 enough people? Is it 10,000? How many people would you consider a good, healthy poll?
So this is a big statistical question, is how many what amount of a population do you need to actually show that population as a whole in a very correlated way. And what that basically means is, what's the minimum amount of people can you take out of that population to represent the rest of it?
Mhm.
So this is all about sample size and stuff like that, and we'll get into a little bit later what is a good sample size. But generally, you want around 1,000 people to represent a bigger group of above like 20,000. Really, after that, it gets statistically, it's better to have a bigger sample. So if you can get 50,000 people, that's good, but that's unrealistic. And statistically, there isn't much of a difference between the accuracy of 50,000 people and 1,000. I know a lot of people will be a little bit confused by that, but mathematically, you can represent like a lot of different size of groups between 50 and 1,000. And it's the accuracy is like very few percentage points, if any.
All right, so about 1,000 people is what you would say. Cool on that one. Another
Yeah.
thing, me if I was an average everyday person, if I'm looking at a poll, let's say online, and let's say it's Real Clear Politics, right? Let's say we're using that website to look at polls, as I know many of our viewers like to point out to us to use. You see a difference between kind of, it says voters and then it says, let's say 1,000 RV and then you see 1,000 LV. I'm pretty sure RV is registered voters and then LV is likely voters. Can you talk a little bit on the difference between both and which one you would prefer if you were a pollster?
So I'll quickly comment. I use a lot of Real Clear Politics. That's my main website I go to. We don't mention it as much because it's more of an aggregate of polls. And like really that's not useful until later in the cycle when you can see trends and you can see a lot more data points in states. But moving on to the question, so registered voters and likely voters, those are two different things. You can be registered and never gone out to vote, and you can go out to vote all the time. You're registered, but those two groups aren't the same, and it's a really it it's a finesse argument because sometimes likely voters will be more accurate because you're asking, are you likely to vote? And if you're picking up the phone call and you got to the point where you're answering that question, typically you're more of an engaged voter anyways. So there's a lot of questions and debates in the polling community, like whether you should use that or not more than often. But overall, I tend to like LV, but RV numbers, I would just say hold that with slightly more grain of salt. It doesn't mean one or the other is like based in stone, that's what's going to happen, but that's the difference. It's very minute, and it's just who is more willing to say, yeah, I'm going to definitely go out and vote on election day.
Yeah, yeah, I totally can see that. Another question that we have today just on the polls is as we're talking, we use real clear politics because you said it's a big sample size of many different polls. Now, speaking of those polls, people that do those polls, the polling agencies, there's like CNN, there's Fox News, there's tons and tons of different agencies and even cities that do their own polls. How can you tell the difference between ones that are biased and ones that are reliable, and how do you draw the line of which ones you should actually trust?
Um, So that's a difficult question because people have their own biases and they like polls that agree with them. We've seen that a lot of times. Even parties have eternal polls. And some parties tend to like to take the worst favorable outcome and the most favorable outcome. And by what I mean is not necessarily are they looking for a biased outcome. They tend to take the aggregate, not aggregate, but they tend to take the environment in which they're taking the poll. So let's say that Missouri example, a Republican firm may take the worst outcome possible, which is higher African American turnout, lower, let's say, pro Republican voter turnout, and say, if that's the case, then how will we fare? So there's a lot of things that go into polling when it comes to stuff like that, but a good poll I generally say is higher number of people polled,
Mhm.
obviously, the lowest possible margin of error, and that's typically done with bigger samples, more accurate population aggregate. So like going back to that Missouri, if a poll took, let's say, 30% Hispanics in there, but really Missouri only has 10%, you'll be like, well, what about that 20% that isn't really there in the actual state? So stuff like that, you want to kind of look for. I tend to not look at just one polling firm as like perfect or one polling firm as terrible. There are terrible polling firms, but when it comes to the overall, I like to take every poll as an aggregate, kind of
Mhm.
look at them independently because polls by themselves aren't perfect and aren't a picture perfect representation of what they're going on. They're just a ballpark kind of estimate of what's going on. I like to think of it as you are listening to someone who they themselves are watching a football game and relaying it through then the announcers relaying it. And you can kind of see how there's information loss. It's like telephone. You're going to lose some information along the way because they are talking to voters and they're kind of implying what they think voters' intentions are in the future. So a lot can be missed in that, and that's how you get margin of error and kind of stuff like that. And that's why polls aren't always picture perfect.
Yeah, I heard you talking about margin of error a couple times during that answer,
Mm,
and we will get to that in just a second. But I want to talk about this question first, and it is: if you're looking at any poll, let's say Biden versus Trump, and let's say you pick, let's say Florida and Trump has plus 2.5. That's just out of my head. What does that plus 2.5 mean? Is it 2.5%, 2.5 thousand votes? What does that plus whatever mean in terms of winning and losing?
So 2.5 means that candidate is above by 2.5%. But I will preface this with it is a idea or a, let's say, a snapshot in that moment of time that that person is possibly leading by 2.5%. So that can be a little confusing by most voters, but if you just look at it by 2.5% and you look at the margin of error, and I'll bring that up again, and if it's 2.5%, that means in reality the other person could be winning by 2.5%. That margin error basically means it can swing within 5 points of who's winning or who's losing.
Yeah, basically the last question is kind of what we've been saying all throughout this is margin of error. What you just said, Alice, with the 2.5% example, that the opposing opponent could also win the election, but did you say 5% or 2.5%? It's such a weird concept to me still, me even trying to learn. And I know it for a fact it's confusing for a lot of people. I think if you look back in 2016, a lot of the reason why Hillary Clinton, so many of her supporters were like, "Oh, we got this. We're not gonna lose," and they didn't go out to vote, was because the polls were saying +2, +3, +4. But people don't understand is this margin of error. What is it? How does it work? And how much do people care if they really care about their candidate?
So I will preface with a specifically 2016 example. People don't understand that state polls are very much worse than national polling. A, because you don't have as many. B, because they're not as good quality in smaller samples. So people need to, and we do our election by state, not by national. So people need to preface that, look at it separate. You look at every state separately from every cycle. So that's one of those things where in a national election, the national polls were actually very accurate when it comes to who won the national vote. That's not how we elect the president. So just look at that. Now, back to margin of error. What is that? Basically, margin of error is basically saying within that 2.5% or 5% as a whole range, that's where 90% of your results will fall. It's around 90%. So you have a 90% chance the results will actually fall within that 5% or that 5% vote total. So if it's over here, that means, let's say Biden wins Florida by 2.5% and the polls were right. Or it can mean if it's over here, 2.5% for Trump. Or if it's in the middle, it's a dead tie. So it's a 90% chance to be anywhere within those result kind of level. So you can think of it as a golfer taking a shot and you're within 5 feet. That's a 90% chance shot that it goes all the way and it makes it in, but it can still miss. So polls aren't perfect, but margin error gives you where 90% chance where the results will fall. So typically you want to be within a lead outside of that margin of error and then double the margin of error if you want to be out of the worst case scenario.
So if let's say you're Trump or Biden and you're trying to win each state, what is the margin of error they need to basically be, unless of course worst case scenario, a victory in that state?
So, typically it depends on the state and the polls you're looking at. That's why you need to look at these polls and the margin errors, because sometimes news analysts are very bad with explaining, like, oh, this has a margin error of 4.5%. That's a lot. That means it can swing within 9 points of whatever the total is. So that's why you want those lower ones, less risk. Um, so if it's at 2.5%, you want to be with a 6 point lead, and that means statistically your lead is pretty safe. But if it's lower than that 6 points, then your lead is kind of a little not as solid as you want. So, for example, Hillary Clinton, lost Michigan by 0.1% of the vote. But Obama won it by 10 points. That's a 10-point swing, right?
Yep.
The polls, I think, had her winning by 6 or 4 points. And within all those margin errors, statistically, Trump could have won. So that was a worst case for the Hillary Clinton camp. Uh, Pennsylvania and Wisconsin were a little bit more closer with the polls, but generally you can see it does happen. It's rare, but it does happen,
Yeah.
especially when it's
Yeah.
a state and it's less polling.
But yeah, Ashton, thank you for answering the questions as if you're the end all be all of polls, which we know it's not
I'm
true.
not. I'm not. I took a good amount of statistics classes. I love reading polls and stuff like that. I feel like they get a bad rap because people look at them the wrong way. They see them as just black and white. That's the results that will happen. When in reality, those are what the results might be if it were today. So it's a snapshot, and it's it's not roughly like people think. So it just kills me when people don't understand what they're looking at. So try to educate yourself, guys, and just polls are fun though. If you know how to read them and you see some trends or another way to read polls, I will say that to people. Look at the trends more than polls specifically, individually. So that's my spiel for today.
But yeah, thank you, Ashton, for answering these questions, and thank you guys for watching this video as we are trying to just inform you a little bit about the polls, how margin error works, why, if you're going to look back in the 2016 example, if you are a Hillary Clinton fan, why she lost, and vice versa, if you're a Donald Trump fan, why he won. In the coming weeks, next week on Friday, we're going to be doing our Florida state election profile. That one's going to be an interesting one. We know how Florida is, Ashton. I think the week after that, we're going to get back to our June general election profile. But yeah, guys, thank you for watching. Stay safe out there. I know it feels like the coronavirus is just gone now because of the way the rest of the news is, but it's not. So still stay safe, and we'll catch you in the next video, guys.